All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our Timely Topics uh, program where we bring in one of our partners and to talk a little bit about things that overlap between family and their specific skill sets and expertise. And so today we're joined by Foster Group, which has been one of our founding partners since we started. Grateful to have them with us today. Today we have Geoff Christy and Tyler Craig, and I will let them introduce themselves as we get going here. Um, Thankful to have them on for our timely topic. One thing I want to mention is that we do record these sessions. These are really the only sessions that we record for privacy sake, confidentiality sake for our membership. But in these cases where we are doing something that's a little bit more broad, involving our partners, we want to make sure that this information can get to our audience over time as it becomes pertinent to them. And so we do record these. So with that said, Geoff, Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to talk a little bit about retirement. We're going to talk a little bit about tax. We're going to talk a little bit about how I can put more money in my pocket as a family business owner and things like that today. So I'm excited to hear a little bit more about that. And I'll let you guys get started. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. We appreciate it. My name is Geoff Christy. My colleague, Tyler Craig. We're very pleased to be able to join you today and share some thoughts about retirement. Maybe not the most exciting topic for everybody, but Tyler and I have spent most of both of our careers in this and love the opportunity to just jump in and talk about some of the nuances of retirement planning. If you go to that next slide there, we are going to hit on a few different things. We're going to talk some about your process for governance and your fiduciary responsibilities as a business owner, as a 401k retirement plan sponsor. We're going to talk about the importance of controlling plan expenses, how you know whether you're controlling plan expenses, what you should be looking at. And then, as Dan mentioned, talk a little bit about just retirement plan design, how you might be able to maximize the ability to save, not just for the owners of the business, but for really everyone in the business. There are just some things within 401ks, profit sharing, cash balance, that we're surprised as we talk to business owners, even some larger businesses that may not know some of the nuances and some of the opportunities that exist. So all of these topics here that we just listed, gosh, we could probably do an hour-long seminar on every one of them, but we're going to try to squeeze this down just here into the half an hour or so. So we're going to hit some highlights, give you some things to think about, and certainly allow you to jump in, ask any questions if you would like to. So that's kind of where we're headed today. We thought maybe before we jump into some of the specifics of the information, just a minute for you about Foster Group.
Perfect.
And a little bit about maybe me and Todd. So I have been in the financial services business for a little over 31 years. I've been at Foster Group for, about 5 years. Tyler, 9 years in the business, about 4 years at Foster Group. I went to Simpson College undergrad, Drake University grad school. Tyler went to University of Iowa. We're pleased to be able to join you. Foster Group is who we're with. And so a couple of things on Foster Group there. Dan mentioned we're a founding sponsor. We're proud to be a sponsor and partner with the UNI Family Business Center. We are a financial services firm that is located, our headquarters is in West Des Moines. We also have an office in Omaha. We're approaching management of around $4 billion in assets for a little over 1,800 clients that span kind of coast to coast. And I guess the one thing I would point out on this slide just about us is that we are an independent firm. We're a multi-generational firm and employee shareholders. So that's a little bit about us. A couple of things there it mentions. We work with both individuals as well as institutions. So Tyler and I are on the institutional team that work with businesses and nonprofits, primarily on 401k plans, but also managing money for endowments and foundations. And then we also have, of our 85 or so team members, about 30 individual financial planning advisors that work with many business owners and individuals as well. So, and I know some of you are familiar with us. We do work with a few of the UNI Family Business Center organizations already currently. So a little bit on us. Tyler, anything else you want to add to that in terms of an intro?
No, I think you hit it. Did great.
All right, perfect. Well, let's keep rolling then. And jump into the first thing we're going to talk about, just plan governance and fiduciary responsibilities. And the one thing, I guess the question I'll ask you is, how confident are you that the plan that you have, thinking 401k specifically, is compliant and is cost efficient. And if you ask yourself that question, some of you might not necessarily be too confident in answering that. I recently read, it was an article talking about the fact that as many as up to 40% of 401k plans across the country have some sort of compliance issue that they face annually. And there's a variety of different things that they could face. There's eligibility errors, so they're letting people into the plan that aren't eligible or shouldn't be eligible. There's contribution limit violations that cause refunds, and oftentimes that happens to the highly paid or the owners. There's late remittance of contributions. They withhold the money, doesn't get sent in quickly enough. And so, we're surprised, I think, at how often we run into plans that have these types of issues. So a key for you as a business owner is really to structure a foundation to protect the plan, protect your business. You want to have processes in place that make sure you are covered from a fiduciary perspective, as well as just from an oversight perspective. So we'll talk some more about some of those things, how you can offload some of that risk. We talk about fiduciary and, why does having oversight matter? And we listed a couple of things here. And, we're seeing just an increasing number of lawsuits and penalties for mismanagement of the plans. And some of these penalties and fees can be very, very severe. There was a case I was just reading about recently that just settled last fall in Northern California. An employee were the plaintiff. They sued their employer for breach of fiduciary responsibility. They said they were not appropriately managing and controlling the costs of the plan. And it did settle before it ended up going to trial, but it cost this small business $250,000 in settlement. So why does oversight matter? Obviously, I'm sure there's no one on here that wants to have to pay a $250,000 settlement, or worse yet, go to trial and have to pay any more, where by having some processes in place to protect against those things can help you avoid that. I mentioned on the previous slide, roughly 40% of plans have some sort of compliance issue going on. In a lot of instances, the business isn't even aware of what some of those gaps might be. So, ways you can avoid that is one is having processes in place to ensure that you're covering it, and two, working with a fiduciary advisory group like a foster group or someone else to help. Your business is not the retirement business, our business is. And so partnering with somebody that can help point out what things you should be thinking about, which we'll continue to get into a little bit more here as we move forward. Let me pause there, though. I should have asked Dan, if people have questions, should they click the chat? Should they raise their hand? How would you like them to enter questions?
Yeah, I've already gotten one that I'm going to hold on until we get there. But we sent out in some of our messaging beforehand and to anyone that registered, but they can either text Jane. Sometimes they like to ask their questions anonymously, so we go with that route. They can text me, or they can ask them right here in the Q&A if they want to, if they're willing to. That's great too. So we can see them either those
perfect
ways.
Well, if there's one that pops up and you want to just interrupt us and ask us, we'll be happy to jump in on that.
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Great. So that's a little bit just on the oversight piece to make sure you have a process in place. You want to document the processes, because obviously nobody wants to run into situations where you're writing big checks for fees or penalties. So with that, let's transition and talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of all the groups that are involved in sponsoring and providing a 401k plan. And Tyler's going to touch on some of those for us.
Thanks, Geoff. And yeah, as we could see, and anyone who has a retirement plan, you certainly know there's a lot of parties involved. And as we're structuring our fiduciary processes, it's just helpful to take inventory, what those roles are, what the responsibilities are. Got some of the main ones listed here. The first item, the plan sponsor, that's typically your business owner, maybe some key members of your executive team. That is the employer who is providing or sponsoring this benefit for the participants. And your legal responsibilities to ensure that this plan operates in the best interest of the employees and the beneficiaries. So at the end of the day, liability would flow all the way up to the plan sponsor. But the plan sponsor you're not required to, but it is a best practice to form a committee or a subcommittee, a team that's going to be responsible for reviewing this plan on a regular cadence. Ideally, documenting your decisions with meeting minutes, so that you have a paper trail of the decisions that have been made.
So if we have that committee, Tyler, do we put employees on it, or it's just ownership on it and our third party vendors, or who is on there? And how do we cover our ass best in that scenario?
Yeah, great question, Dan. So committee typically is going to be structured your key decision makers on the plan. So you can think about this more in terms of titles. This could be a CEO, CFO, could be an HR, or an office manager. Primarily the people that have direct
Okay.
decision-making authority on the plan or they
And so then
interact with it.
at that point they have fiduciary liability then too, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, perfect. I'll quit asking questions. Keep going. Thanks.
No, all good. So the committee, they do have that fiduciary responsibility. They're in charge of monitoring the rest of these service providers. Like I said, documenting these decisions. A
Yep.
lot of times your advisor is going to assist the committee if you work with an advisor, um, for help selecting these different service providers, benchmarking costs, providing education and assistance with your fiduciary process. One thing though to note on the investment advisor, there's many ways they can serve with an investment fiduciary function. There's two listed on the screen there, 321 or 338. Those are IRS terms. But essentially, that just is the capacity the advisor is working for your committee. The one that's not listed here, you could call it education only. That would be your advisor is not providing you investment recommendations. That responsibility falls to the committee. The committee is responsible for selecting an investment lineup, monitoring the performance of those funds, and having a rationale for picking a fund, removing it, keeping it,
They're
etc.
just they're just coming in to talk about the time value of money and you need to be diversified and do something and not nothing, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they're going to be more of an education piece, primarily for employees, but also might help with some of the selection of the other parties involved.
Okay.
Once we get into these two designations, so the 321 is a co-fiduciary role. And in this instance, the advisor is going to essentially provide you, here's a recommended list of funds that we think are suitable for a retirement plan.
Yep.
That's where it would end. It is still up to the committee at that point to select a lineup of funds from that recommendation.
All
At the
right.
end of
So
the day, they still make that decision or have that discretion. And then the third option there would be the full investment manager 338 fiduciary. In this role, the committee is essentially outsourcing the investment monitoring selection process to the advisor, giving them the discretion to make those changes. Now, this doesn't absolve a committee from their fiduciary responsibility, it just shifts it so that the committee is then responsible for ensuring the advisor is following a process and doing what they say they're doing, following an investment policy statement, providing reporting on the selection and monitoring of funds, documented rationale.
okay.
The last two items there, record keeper and TPA. So you may have one, you may have both. Record keeper, they handle a lot of the infrastructure of your plan. They're going to manage your participant accounts, your online access. They'll actually hold custody of the funds and complete the transactions. A record keeper is not operating in a fiduciary role, but it is vital to your plan's success. The TPA, that stands for third party administrator, they would be ultimately responsible for your legal compliance of your plan. They're going to create and maintain your plan document, complete annual compliance testing. There is potential for a TPA to act as a fiduciary to a plan, but they don't have to. And then some of the other roles would be kind of depends on circumstances. If you have a defined benefit plan, you're going to partner with an actuary who's going to provide you annual valuation for different contributions you need to make. Large plans over 100 participants require an annual audit. So you have an auditor you work with annually. And then another key piece to retirement plans increasingly is your payroll provider, who can provide integration with a record keeper so that you aren't manually responsible for uploading contributions, changing deferral rates, loan payments, things like that. So integration is a great way to mitigate some fiduciary errors. I'm a visual learner, so this is the flow chart view, typically of how we would work with our clients. And this shows how the plan sponsor can delegate down to the committee, down to the advisor. And we believe the advisor really is playing a strategic role beyond just being an investment guide. So more of the quarterback for your retirement plan, helping you evaluate all of the record keepers, TPAs, other providers that are available in the marketplace, bringing you, up-to-date knowledge, best practice, and standards for these providers. Also responsible for benchmarking these fees and services, reporting that back to your committee.
Sure.
So the next piece we shared here is just asking you the question, are you covered from a fiduciary perspective? And this is certainly not a comprehensive list, but a couple of things to highlight that we think are very important and that are from some fairly simple steps you can take to help cover yourself from a fiduciary perspective. The first one is, do you have an investment policy statement, a written document that really guides how the decision-making is made around what kind of investments will be made in the plan? Are you going to use mutual funds where there'll be a self-directed brokerage account? How are you going to compare and evaluate those funds? And I would say it's important regardless of whether you're taking on all that decision-making on the investments as the employer, or if you're hiring an advisor as a 321 or a 338, you should really have a written IPS regardless of what relationship you have, that just is a document that you can point back to. Because if you run into a situation where a fund increases their fees or has poor performance or whatever might happen that an employee might be disgruntled about, it gives you something to point back to say, well, this is why this fund was in the plan. This is how we evaluated it. But really just having that written framework for how you're going about making the investments available. That's the first thing. And I would, like a lot of things that we've already said, we run into many employers that do not have one of those. It's one of the first questions we ask when we start working with a client. Can you show us your IPS? And many don't have one. Or they have one that was drafted 15 years ago and haven't looked at it since, and it dramatically needs to be updated. Second thing that mentions there is, have you benchmarked your fees in the last 12 months? Absolutely, one of your fiduciary responsibilities as a plan sponsor or as a committee member is making sure that your fees are fair and reasonable in the marketplace. And the DOL doesn't give you a black and white answer for what is fair and reasonable, but what you should be doing as a fiduciary is at least evaluating, well, what are we paying for our services versus what is available in the marketplace? So have you done that in the last 12 months? We work with all of our clients to look at that once a year. I would say that what the DOL says is you need to be doing it every 3 to 5 years. So you don't have to do it every year, but you certainly should be doing it periodically. And then, as Tyler mentioned before, do you have clearly defined roles around who's doing this? And do you have documented processes for how often you're going to meet? Is somebody keeping meeting minutes that you can point back to for when you make decisions? Why did you make decisions? What decisions did you make, et cetera? The big one, probably the biggest one that we see that get complaints from clients, or gets complaints, I should say, from participants of clients, and where we see a lot of lawsuits around are the plan expenses. 401k plan gets set up, it operates for 15, 20 years. They never really make any changes to anything. And so the expenses, particularly when the expenses are shared with the plan participants, because as a plan sponsor, there's a couple of ways you can handle the fees. You can have the fees billed to the business can pay it as a tax deductible expense, or you can pass those 401k fees on to your participants. And that's where you really run into needing to make sure that what you are passing on is not an undue burden to your participants. So it's really important to know, first of all, what are you paying for the various components? There's a lot of things that go into a 401k. There's, Tyler mentioned some of them. There's the investments, there's the record keeper or the TPA, there's the advisory firm. So there's all the components, which it seems every provider kind of creates their expenses in a different way. And so it can be somewhat tricky and difficult to get your finger on exactly what you are paying for each one of these components. But the first thing is knowing what you're paying for them. Then the second thing is, how does that compare to what else is available in the market for a similar plan size-wise as the one that you're sponsoring for your employees? There's industry data that shows that upwards of about 80% of plans are likely paying more in administrative fees than they should be. And again, a lot of that's because they just haven't benchmarked it. The piece we're sharing here for you is a piece that shows this is something we do for all of our clients on an annual basis, where we just take a look and say, all right, what are you paying for your fees? How does that compare to the market? So this is an example of a group that has $25 million in their plan, 400 participants. It's being benchmarked to about 150 plans of similar size, so they're not all exactly the same size. But then those components that I mentioned, so you see listed down the left, and this is just a hypothetical, it's not an actual group. But on the investments, they likely have a fund menu that has Fidelity funds and Vanguard funds and principal funds and, a whole mix of different investment managers. There's a record keeper's cost, which is there's, half a dozen of the biggest providers are probably Principal, Fidelity, Vanguard, Empower, Schwab. Those are some of the main names that you would see from a record keeper's perspective. Administration, that might be done by the record keeper, or it might be a third-party TPA like Tyler talked about. And then the advisory fees, would be, what are you paying that fiduciary advisor who is helping you with the investment choices on the plan, and then also delivering services, education, advice services to your participants. So as I look at sort of this example, a couple things we would point out in this situation is this plan has an opportunity to maybe change some of their funds to lower their average fund cost in the investment piece. That's on the higher end. The record keeping costs are on the higher end. The administrative costs look like they're right in line, and then their advisory costs are, between the average and the high. So the bottom line we always point out is that 0.95, in this case, 95 basis points or 190,000, that's high. It's not the highest, but it's high. And so if we ran something like this would be a situation where we would likely go get live RFPs to see, well, what does existing plan pricing look like? Because there's a couple of things when you benchmark. The first one is you want to see, what does your pricing look like compared to market? That's what this is. But the other thing to note about market is that those low, average, and high costs that you're seeing, those would include a lot of plans that maybe haven't repriced their plan in many years. And so it's important, first of all, to just make sure you're not out of whack with market, but then that every 3 to 5 years, go into a live RFP to see, hey, has new plan pricing on any one of these components come down even more? And so often we're able to help clients achieve savings in, usually, if not all of these categories, 2 or 3 of these categories. I'm going to pause there. Yeah, question.
I had a question from somebody that curious about switching and levels of, there's hassles, his words, not mine, with switching. And at what point do you make those switches? How does that impact my employees as far as them feeling like, well, this is constantly changing and I can't keep up with it, and they get turned off?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And yes, if you completely change record keeping providers, the record keeping and administration piece, so that say you're moving it from a principal financial group to a Fidelity, and you're going to completely have to transfer the employees' accounts, the money's going to transfer, they're going to have a new login, a new password. That's the most painful piece of a 401k transition. It requires probably a 60 to 90-day lead time to do that. You have required government notices that you have to give employees that you're switching the plan. There's not a singular answer for when it makes sense. I think it's a combination. When we see clients making that move, it's a combination of there's just a significant fee savings that they can't ignore, or they're not getting the service that they need. The compliance testing, gets messed up every year, or they're late getting information to them to file their 5500. That's the one that is more challenging. The one that we encounter from time to time that is much easier to do is the advisory switch. And so as an advisor, it's typically a third-party advisor not connected to the record keeper who is providing the investment advice and the education for the employees. So we'll run into situations where, business will call us and they say, our 401k is with Principal. They do a good job. We like them, but we're working with XYZ advisor. They're not attentive to my employees' needs. They're not meeting with us regularly. They haven't fee benchmarked our plan. And so those are situations, if you change advisors, that is pretty painless. You can switch advisors on a plan. Nothing changes for the employees other than they have a new advisor they're going to interact with. We just did this with a group yesterday where we went out, met with their employees. Hey, we're replacing XYZ firm, but your login's the same, your plan's the same, but now you're just going to get an enhanced level of service. So yeah, it just depends on what the needs are and how painful it gets.
So that in that case, that's Foster or your competitors. That is a little easier to kick them to the curb when they're not doing what I need them to do in terms of either keeping me at a lower expense ratio, making sure I don't have dog funds in there, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
My
exactly.
employee base isn't going to necessarily feel a lot of that. So then a question that I have here, another one that I got earlier was about switching and how I'm trying to figure out his question wasn't worded the best. So, but how do you, how much do you anticipate your customers keeping you honest from an RFP standpoint? And at what point, do you get sick of that? Or I don't know how he's kind of
Well,
wondering how to approach his longtime advisor and not piss them off by saying, hey, I think you're charging me too much type of thing.
yeah. I mean, we have, very, very transparent pricing from Foster Group and very transparent pricing and information sharing about all these components every single year with our clients. So the fee piece is front and center. It's transparent. They know what it is. Now, absolutely a business should periodically take a look at their advisor as well and say, well, we should look at the market and see what are other advisors charging and what are their services. And yeah, there's somebody at the business that would, want to go and ask advisors for what they would charge, what services they would provide. But if you're already working with an advisor, I would advise you to lean on that advisor to do an RFP for the other components of the plan. That's part of what they are getting paid to do and should be doing. If they're not doing it today, you really shouldn't feel bad about asking them for it because it's something that they should be delivering.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Geoff.
Yep. When you look at these costs and you look at, 95 basis points, 87 basis points, sometimes the difference in costs may not seem that significant where it's 10 basis points more or it's 30 basis points more, but over time, and especially if you're passing the costs on to the participants, unchecked fees can really eat at the employee's savings kind of longer term. So jump to that next one, Tyler, if you would. And it's just a quick illustration on, this is an employee that's 25. They work for 40 years. They start out with 25,000. They're saving 5,000 a year and they earn 7%. And we just wanted to illustrate the impact of what do some of these just small fee differences maybe mean. Now, obviously you're not going to have a plan with no fees, but just to illustrate what that savings would grow to over time, this person would end up with 1.5 million if they had no fees deducted from their account. And then you can see just the difference between 25 basis points or 50 or 1%, can mean hundreds of thousands of dollars in differences for that employee over their career, which is why it's critical that a plan sponsor really understand what they're paying and minimizing those fees as much as they can. And like I said, many employers will pass on, their total cost might be 50 basis points. And so the plan might be large enough that they can pass on 50. It covers all the fees. The business doesn't get billed anything. Or they may make a decision to say, hey, we want to take on some of this cost ourselves. It's a tax deductible expense. We want to minimize fees. And so if the plan costs 50, for example, they might only have 25 basis points passed on to the employees. They'll have the other 25 basis points billed to the business. The business pays that tax deductible. So there's different ways to slice and dice it, but I guess the point of what we were just showing here is that even small differences in the percentages, which might not seem like much, can really add up to a ton over time. And that's where you'll run into issues down the road with, employees that get disgruntled as they get to that 50 age plus and they start to look at their account and they start to look at their fees and they go, well, I've been paying X amount of fees for 30 years and it cost me $300,000. I could have retired, in 5 years if I had that 300,000 or whatever the case might be.
Yep.
So it can definitely eat at it over time. Yeah, and with that, I'm going to shift it back to Tyler, talk a little bit about oversight.
Just a quick time check, Dan. We're at 12:30. Are we okay to keep going for
Yeah.
10
minutes? Let's keep going for another 10 minutes and get this covered. I think this is important. I think this is an area where people sometimes forget that they're not spending some time. Like I think fees and expenses are something that get focused on a lot with a pretty big lens, but not always some of these other things.
Yeah, we're going to jump into maximizing your plan design. And a huge piece of this, we've already talked about the structure and the getting the right people in the room, getting the right parties involved, understanding your fees, understanding what services you're getting. Another critical piece of this is really understanding the options you have for plan design, so that you can legally and efficiently save more tax advantaged. As a business owner for key employees, you can also help the entire team. And I think one of the things we often run into with businesses, they just aren't aware that they can do a lot more. A big thing with these retirement plans, there can be a lot of jargon, a lot of IRS codes. So there just needs to be some education on all these different contribution types that are available. So we got 3 of them listed here at the top: safe harbor, additional matching contributions, and profit sharing contributions. You can have a profit sharing only plan. So sometimes business owners aren't aware that you can have all of these money types in the same 401k plan. But at the highest level here, a safe harbor contribution is a guaranteed contribution you're going to provide to your employees, and that's going to be fully vested. By offering that, it's going to allow you or any employee to maximize up to the IRS annual deferral limit without having to worry about any distributions or kickbacks because of failed testing. So that's kind of our first foundational level. And then above that, you can do additional match types. So you can have a safe harbor match and a discretionary match in addition to that. You can also have a profit sharing contribution, which can really get additional savings into the plan. So it's really important to structure all of these appropriately, so that you can reward your long tenured employees who are key to your business. It's a great way for maybe non-family executives as well. Maybe they might not get ownership in the company, but having a really robust retirement plan may be a benefit that keeps them in. It also helps with a succession. This allows the senior generation to accelerate savings. We'll take a look at an example here.
Great. Okay.
Cash balance plan can do that. What we're looking at here are 2025 contribution limits for different ages. And we have, our 401k. These groups would have a catch-up contribution. Down here, they're getting to the max. So assume they have a safe harbor plan. It allows you to save this much. This column would be additional employer match or profit share. It can get you to this amount. And then I mentioned, the group that's trying to accelerate savings. Something we're seeing come up more and more is a cash balance plan. It can really supercharge. You can consolidate, 20 years of savings into 10 or less. Really, particularly for the older generation, you're able to get in significant amount on a tax advantage basis. So it can lead to a lot of tax savings. And one of the great things about a cash balance is that that money can then be rolled over into an IRA and continue to be tax deferred.
Can you give us an example, Tyler, of kind of a family situation that might where that might come into play, where the older generation does want to stock a bunch of cash away type of thing. Maybe they haven't for a long time because they've been reinvesting, or just if you could give us an example of how you've seen that work.
Great segue, Dan. This is an illustration. Now, this is using last year, 2024's numbers, but I would say the scenario you outlined is one of the most common we see.
Okay.
From this example, you can see in the green, we have different groups. So with that profit sharing, we're able to target or group employees into specific categories to kind of skew the benefit. Let's just say in this example, these four owners, like you said, they've been reinvesting in the business for years and years, and they want to find a way to get out.
Hmm.
Maybe, $77,000 a year isn't enough. So that's where the cash balance piece can come in. And because of the way the actuarial calculation works, the older you are and the more you make relative to others
Hmm.
allows you to put in substantial amounts. And you can tailor it, and it's beneficial to other areas of the company as well. For these, just the normal staff getting 7.5% of their pay as a profit sharing can be really meaningful long term. And
Okay.
also doing
Yeah,
all this, you stay compliant.
the one comment I was going to make is just that, to your question too, Dan, is for the business owner group. I think where I've seen it is, yeah, they've invested in the business. They maybe either haven't contributed to the 401k or haven't contributed much, and now
Right.
they get to that age 50 and above, and it's like, I really need to sock away some money here. Well, the 30,500 or the 70,000 with profit sharing, that's not going to do a lot for me. But if I could put away $300,000 for the next 3 or 4 years,
Hmm.
that makes a huge difference.
Oh yeah, and you can put that in tax deferred money, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
And keep it that way and wait on it till I get to 70 to whatever age you want to get to, and okay,
Yep.
and pull it out at a different tax bracket than when you're earning annual salaries of 350,000 a year, right?
Correct. Yep. Exactly.
Okay. Okay.
For that younger owner, they're getting a great benefit as well. It might set the stage of, hey, this is in place. I have a way to exit in the future because the amount I'm saving is going to keep going up
Yep.
over time. So
And
last section, go ahead, Dan.
they can do that and still be in compliance, as long as they're giving a 2-3% contribution to their employees overall, correct?
When you get into the profit sharing and cash balance, it's going to increase above the 2-3%. We might be talking 5-7%,
So
but
if I want to put 300,000 away, I've got to probably bump up to more like 5% on my employee side for a match. Is that what you're saying?
it's going to be a combination of what's the best fit based on your employee demographics, and what
Yep.
goals you're trying. But yes, in essence, yes.
Okay.
But of
All
the
right.
grand total that you're providing in profit sharing, in this case, 256,000, 180 of it's going to your key owners.
Yeah.
Um, and then 1.1 million in cash balance, over a million of it's going to the owners. So you can
The
stay
other
compliant and really benefit who you want to benefit.
the other quick comment I'd make just about the cash balance plans is that there are actuarial valuations and calculations that have to take place. That
Sure.
increases the cost of those. So they're fairly expensive from an administrative standpoint, but when you look at what the tax savings are, they dwarf the cost. And so often the cost benefit, hey, it still makes sense to do it if you have the cash flow there to do it. Because even though they cost a lot, your tax benefit and your amount you're going to be able to save is worth the cost.
And the actuarial firms know that, and so they're charging
Well,
plenty.
actuaries they're expensive.
Yep. Okay. Uh, but just don't get scared off by cost and look at the total
Right.
cost benefit
Yeah,
solution there, right?
for
Okay.
sure.
Thank you.
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, pay 10,000, 15,000 annual for the ability for 1 million tax deferred savings.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, to wrap this up here, we've talked through a lot of work that goes into building this really well-designed retirement plan. And ultimately, the retirement plans are intended to be a benefit for your employees. And ideally, if they're designed well enough, it can be a culture benefit. It can create a culture where the employees are viewing this as a great benefit, which ultimately is going to be more motivated employees, more educated employees, more loyal.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
in your
Stickier.
family business, your people, they're not just employees, they're your legacy. So if you're investing in them, they're going to invest back in you. And simply just sending out annual notices isn't enough for engagement. We think, real engagement is tailoring an education program to your specific demographic needs. Go out and meet with employees every week. And I know 401k is not top of mind for most people, but in those moments of life that matter, they want to be able to get access to information quickly, know who to go to, and be able to trust that partner. So for us, we think it all really starts with finding the right partner, someone that is going to work with you strategically. Maybe you have multiple locations. Maybe you have employees who speak different languages. Depending on your eligibility entry, maybe you have quarterly entry, coordinating with them to make sure the advisor is available when you need them and doing their job. With that, communication's key. We think you should have group education settings and have opportunities for one-on-one meetings. I have right here plain language communication. In those group meetings, some are going to be experts, some are not even going to be listening to this. So you want to be able to relate to everyone from the
Right.
C-suite down to, the entry-level employee. And then on top of that, making sure that you've got interactive tools, online, mobile app, like I said, being able to take action quickly when you want it, and when you need it. So I think it's really important finding the right partner that can build a program for you. But even with a super well-structured program, we often see employees who are hesitant to take action, and it might not be because they don't care, it just might be inertia gets in the way. They might be all motivated to take action, and then life happens and they just don't ever do it. So another piece that can help with building that retirement culture, is your plan design and making sure that your plan works with human behavior and not against it. So a feature like automatic enrollment, this is the data we're looking at on the screen, that can set the precedent that saving for retirement is not optional, but it's part of our culture because we're going to start you at a rate that's going to help you be ready for retirement. The data here is showing starting contribution rates. So lower rates, 1 to 3%, up to higher percentages. And you can see that the data backs it up here. You can start them or nudge them along at a higher rate than you might think. Here in this example, if you start someone at 10% default contribution rate, this is from Principal Financial Group. Their data shows that 80% of employees stayed at that rate, 4 increased, 10 decreased, but that means they're still in the plan. So we're talking 93% participation for this plan. By starting at lower rates, it keeps more in the default, but you can see the drop off isn't that much. So
No. I mean, if I'm looking at this as an employer, I'm cheap, first of all, but I'm looking at, I don't have to offer a big amount to get people to play ball and being part of it. And it looks like, how does that overlap with like retention data? Is there anything that does that?
yeah, one thing I would say is, we talked about the additional match or profit sharing flexibility,
Hmm.
and you have to make a required contribution of some level. You can get creative and stretch a match out.
Okay, so do something on a
So
vesting schedule or whatever.
yeah, let's say, if you start them at 10%, maybe you're going to match 0.5%. up to 10. So if they save 10, you're going to give 5. That's
Mm-hmm.
15% total savings rate. It's really healthy.
Yeah.
Anything on top of that, profit sharing or whatever, yeah, that's getting employees closer to 20%. That should get them in a pretty strong position.
And you can put different parameters on that profit sharing and cash balance stuff as far as vesting on that and, you know, 5-year rolls or however you might want to do that to keep their handcuffs as tight as you can type of thing. Is that fair? Is that
Absolutely.
okay? Okay.
Definitely fair. That's
All
something we
right.
can go into, but that's another layer that you could plan. So
All right, cool. Yeah, maybe we can do that on another call here. I wanted to get people exposure, first of all, to just, opening their eyes to that they need to keep their advisors honest, I think, and they need to make sure they're working for them, et cetera. And so that's where I wanted to start today and give them some ideas on how they can maybe funnel away some tax advantage money, especially later in their careers. For a lot of our founders, I think that's a powerful tool. So I appreciate you guys covering this, and I don't mean to wrap us up, but if you've got some
No, yeah,
more.
you're fine. That's a great. We're right at a stopping point. We just shared a quote here. I mentioned when we started that we work with a few of your members
Oh yeah.
currently. Yeah, this is a nice quote from Phil at Cooter, which is here in the Des Moines area. They're
Yep.
awesome to work with, and yeah. So hopefully the information that we shared maybe piqued your interest in a couple of things. Might have had you ask a couple of questions. If there's anything any of you would want more information about or have a conversation about, we're more than happy to connect offline with anybody who's interested. So, but yeah, we appreciate our partnership with UNI Family Business Center and appreciate the opportunity to jump on today.
This is cool. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Tyler. I'm just checking my text, but I got to all the questions that I think I needed to get to. But I do have one guy sent me a note. He's now curious about the golden handcuffs. He's heard that term before, he's saying here, and wondering a little bit more about how he works that into, especially his business development people on his staff. So I don't know, maybe we could have you back to do something around that if that'd be cool.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your sponsorship, Foster. Geoff, Tyler, awesome. Appreciate it. And as again, we'll have this recorded and up and refer to it. And so we appreciate your time today. And everybody have a great rest of your Wednesday. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Thanks,
Thank
thank
you,
everybody.
you.
guys.